world is not a perfect place to be in. It never was, and I guess to some degree, it was never supposed to be like that either. There always have been and always will be some events or happenings which makes the world a more unstable place to live in. A place where people turn against each other and worse things always lurk around the corner, like a maze of dark halls. This can definitely be seen in the modern era, where politics, strife and disasters follow suit in a historic storm which has made these times unbearable for some. This might be a good foundation to call the modern day the worst timeline. But despite that, the worst of the worst have never actually happened. We've always overcome our inner struggles and have always survived all threats of human annihilation. But what if it wasn't like that? What if all the events we have just gone through, which has worked like meteorites hitting the planet, were way worse? Imagine a world where brother shall fight brother because of fear, political gains, or simply pure hatred. A world that gets turned on its head as the leading superpower fades away and wars and atrocities, some thought to be impossible in the modern era, spring up all over the world. Imagine a world where hope crashes, peace dies, and the fire rises. Yes, today we're going to take a deeper look into the alternate history scenario of the Hearts of Iron 4 mod called The Fire Rises, which is soon to come out. Yes, I know, a bit unusual for me, but you know. Hearts of Iron revolves around politics and warfare, of course, but with this mod, you can explore the modern alternative universe in a way never seen before in the Steam workshops, overlapping even some of the more famous mods of the game. However, in this video, we will focus mainly on the lore of this mod. So, let's see how bad things could actually have gotten in this 20th decade. I don't think I need to remind you of the events of the past decades, their political strife and their many wars, and to some degree, I can't. However, for context, this might be needed. As the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union too collapsed, the world seemed to go into a much better and more safe place. Since there was only one major superpower now, we could go into a time with democracy, a free liberal market, and safety from any major wars. However, that was apparently not the case. The Russian bear might have been cut down, but was far from dead. Slowly trying to pick up its pieces, Russia tries to find its place in this Western-dominated world. The Arab world too didn't have a great time either, as screams of reforms and a more Western outlook ended in failure as the states began to cut down on this protest, which either gave the opposite effect or ended in a collapsed state like Yemen or Syria. And even the US, which should have gone through a type of golden age as they are now the world power, seemed to have gone down yet another period of chaos and instability. Not since the Civil War has the country been so divided on so many topics. Inequality, poverty, economy, racial issues, foreign policy, and even anger seem to have sparked even more instability in this country, which was lacking it in the first place. And with all these chaotic events of this short decade, and the thought that a peaceful 21st century looks like a faraway idea more than anything else. And even in the 2020s and the modern era, the world is a far less peaceful place to be in than previously expected. The virus attacks, the sloppy economy, worldwide protests, and even two candidates of America, which they had to choose and the rest of the world had to deal with. This is also where our timeline and the TFR timeline splits, as we seem to have survived most of these chaotic events as the corona restrictions are disappearing and the economy slowly come back together. Slowly. However, that is not the case in the TFR timeline. It's in the start of the year 2020, the decade of the many chaotic events, that the TFR timeline begins, and where our timeline looks like a dream compared to theirs. So how bad could things actually have gotten? In this universe, the US is even more rocked by the pandemic as they are simply less prepared for this version of the virus. A bit more surprising, a bit more aggressive. making the pandemic an even more chaotic event. This confusion and anger the lockdown brought with it seemed to have spilled over into other events that year, as people began to march on the streets and take out their anger on the cities, as the protests against police violence and racism becomes more than just peaceful, and the cities begin to fall into states of anarchy. These brawls between law and order could only end badly. This anger seemed to have peaked as a young man by the name of Quinton Evans is shot by a police officer who was confused by the mess and chaos of the protest. Evan died that very night, and along with that did a swift end to the protest, which only became more violent and chaotic. This murder of an innocent civilian leads to many groups like BLM, Antifa, anti-gun groups, and even pro-choice people to form a collective movement simply called the Movement, which makes the many riots and protests around the country more extreme. While the infection rate begins to skyrocket, so does the death count. While any death is a tragedy in itself, some deaths have a bigger impact than others, which can be seen in the other important turning point of this timeline. Saudi Arabia is a country that is very important in the global market, mainly because of oil. Whilst being an important country, it's also a different country. It is one of the only countries in the world that's an absolute monarchy where one man rules it all. Their king, Salman bin Abdulaziz, did survive the pandemic in our timeline pretty well, which is lucky for a guy in his 80s. However, in the TFR timeline, His Majesty wasn't so lucky. Whilst trying his best to avoid the disease, this more aggressive variant didn't spare any, and it ended up in the royal palace where it affected the aging king, who sadly passed away not long after. Now, why must a country like Saudi Arabia, and especially their king, be important in a timeline like this? Well, Saudi Arabia is far from the most stable country in the region, and, after all, it is the Middle East. As the king died suddenly, opportunists tried to get hold of power in the country, as a crown prince, opportunistic princes, and even a liberal reformer makes their voices heard. As murder plots began to take action and clashes began, a total collapse was inevitable, and soon the entire country fell and a civil war began. Despite all sides wanting to wipe out each other, they do agree on one thing: keeping the Grand Mosque in Mecca sacred, and have declared a safe zone around the area. A safe zone which will be exploited by a grim face which shows itself once again in the Middle East, now under a different banner. Again, Saudi Arabia is a kingdom of oil, so even as the world economy had problems because of the pandemic, and the loss of oil sales and the collapse of this rich country ended in economic disaster which most nations simply couldn't handle. China and Europe could do nothing but watch as their revenues fell and their prices skyrocketed. The US had to stand and watch as the economic blow only counted as fuel on the fire, which only seemed to rise and not fall down for a single moment. Could the US ever catch a break in this deadly century? All but Russia, which seemed to enjoy this moment as the large oil deposits in their country, which they could sell to both China, Europe, and themselves, made their economy stable in this unstable time. And for the first time in a long while, the Russian economy was growing. In our timeline, the damage of the disease, the protests, and the economy had more or less fallen down before the US 2020 elections. But with a large economic crash and the memories of Evans still fresh in the American people's mind, then there were still cities burning as the voting booths began to open. These elections could only be important as the country seemed to face so many dangers they would hardly even count to some of them. So who would they pick? The incompetent Donald Trump, which seems to not be an exact help for the mass stability of the country, or the former Vice President Joe Biden, which might be a breath of fresh air or an even worse alternative. These unusual circumstances that the country had to find itself in also meant that people were polarized like never before. Either you were with us or you were against us. There is no longer a middle ground, a collaboration between the two sides. Now it was bloom or doom for the American people. So, who could have won? Just like in American politics, there are two paths you can take, but ultimately they end up going down more or less the same route. So let's take them one at a time and explain how a possible and short presidency from both Trump and Biden would look like.